little bit about Senate Bill 1, which I guess might be the first thing worth drawing attention to, that this is Senate Bill 1. And by virtue of that, I think it is clear that it would be a priority for the majority to pass this bill. And I'm very pleased that they have chosen education as a priority. And, looking through this very, very lengthy strike-all amendment, Madam President, I see certain things that I do like. But I will repeat some of the things that my colleagues have already brought forward today. First, that we're talking about a bill that is 92 pages long, and I believe it contains 87 sections. And it is, in fact, a strike-all amendment. And for those watching, that means that the bill that is before us effectively is an amendment that replaced the entire bill that was passed out of the committee. And that's not to say that much of it is not similar or even the same, but it does mean that we're looking at an entirely new document in a new order with lots of different sections. My colleagues who have spoken already have really done a good job about illustrating their concerns about the bill, which is that I think we have a different view about how to be successful in the future of education in Connecticut. And the Republican focus is on restoring achievement and desire to reach new heights. I was brought up in an era when America, I guess, was at its height. And I went to school when it was just taken for granted that America was like the best at everything. No one even challenged our country in anything. We were the best at every sport. It was clear that we were the military superpower, and the world envied us in almost every regard. And over the last decade or so, I've seen that slide. And it's very, very disturbing. And in one of the ways that I think we're declining is the quality of public education. And I don't place any blame on the school system necessarily, or certainly the teachers. My girlfriend's a teacher. I know she puts in every effort every day to educate the students she comes in contact with. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there are so many people involved in the process. There's an old saying, too many cooks spoil the pot. And I think in some respects that's what's happening. And I'd also say that too many laws can spoil the pot also. And in one respect, I'd say that is probably my biggest issue with this bill, is that it's 87 sections. And each one of them proposes to find a new mechanism for improving education, but also new things for our education system to be involved with. I think we should go back to focusing on the things that really matter, which is teachers and students in the classroom learning the things that are important to prepare them for the world. More and more, there are requirements on school systems, on districts, on teachers to do things other than those things. So I thought I would just get up and kind of go through what my vision is for kind of what the role is for all of the parties involved. I just made a quick list about what everyone's perspective and role should be in education. And maybe this is just my biased view from the way I was brought up, and I feel like I got a good education following this model, which is that first and foremost, I think we have to recognize that parents, more than anyone, should dictate what happens in the classroom. Parents, not government, not even teachers. Teachers are trained to deliver education to students, but it should be parents, ultimately, who decide what that education is, since it's their kids that are being taught. And we should remember that. Teachers. Teachers need more time in the classroom teaching. Today, we put so many requirements on teachers to do things other than educate, completing forms, and basically answering to various levels of government and our inquiries about the status of education and every other aspect of what's required them required of them that doesn't actually involve teaching the students the things that they need to prepare them for the future. And when I speak to teachers, the one thing that they tell me more than anything is they want to teach. They spend a lot of their day doing things other than teaching. They want to teach. I think we should be focused on trying to find ways to allow that to occur. The administration in various school districts. I've watched administrations grow dramatically. The high school that I went to and graduated from, I don't know how much it's changed, but I'd be willing to bet if I walked in and counted the number of people that work in the school district as far as administrators, how many assistant principals there are, how many people work in the office, et cetera, and I'm not knocking any of those people because there's more responsibilities for them than ever created by new laws and new mandates passed on to them through our legislature. But I venture a guess that there's a whole lot more administrators than there were back in the day. I would say the second thing that teachers bring to me as a concern, and actually I was listening on the radio this morning, there was a radio host talking about, I guess, an article that was in the paper, something about how we're losing teachers in Connecticut, and we don't have as many as we need. And he invited people to call in and say, if you're a teacher, what's the problem? Why are teachers leaving the job? Why are they, going to different states? And the people that called in, many of them pointed to the fact that they do not get the proper backup from the administration in the school district. And I can say that I've heard this personally as well from teachers that I know. It used to be that there was a certain element and level of trust that the teacher was doing a good job and they were hired for that purpose. And there was some element of understanding that teachers are in a very difficult position dealing with students, sometimes from very diverse backgrounds. And today, there are so many rules that make it very, very difficult to handle a classroom, especially when you have students that have maybe disciplinary problems. I think we should find ways to help those teachers have more control in their classroom so that they have the power to spend time and devote it towards teaching their students. And I'd hope administrators would do their best to try to back up those teachers and to understand how difficult their jobs are. Boards of education. I talk to a lot of folks who serve on boards of education around the state, and it seems to me there's a lot of confusion about what their role is. I've even had boards of education members that I know and respect very, very highly say that their hands are tied on so many issues because the state says you have to do this, and the state says you have to do that. And I just don't think that's the case. We had a conversation about this notion that somehow boards of education are agents of the state. And I've been back and forth with this with the legal staff over the last year, understanding the statute that they're pointing to. And it's quite clear to me what it means. It means that because we have an obligation based on our state constitution that says that the state of Connecticut must provide a public education, and the mechanism to do so are our school districts, that in that respect, indeed, the Board of Education is an agent of the state. But that very same statute, and I wish I had printed it out because I didn't know I was going to even talk about this, it's very clear that the Board of Education has really significant, if not total control about what happens in the school district as far as curriculum goes. And I don't know that most Board of Ed members really realize the level of authority that they have. That needs to be restored. Superintendents. Superintendents in our system work for the school district. They're hired by the Board of Education. And they should operate like that. And boards of education should assert their authority as the policy-making body. But sadly, in many, many districts, I see that the superintendent effectively is running the school board instead of the other way around. And that should change. The State Department of Education. I've been very critical of the State Department of Education over time. And that's partly because I don't believe the state really should have a role in determining what goes on in our local school districts. There's a reason why we have the system that we do. We live in a bottom-up system with representation. We don't live in a centrally planned, top-down system. Every school district is different. Every student is different. Each of us have rights as individuals, and each school district makes its policy for itself. And the state really has very little business interfering with how a local school district that is elected by the people that live in that town should run their school system. They don't really have that much of an interest. So the state agency that exists for the purpose of, that's a good question. I'd really like to revisit what the purpose of the State Department of Education was originally set out to be. In my view, it ought to be nothing more than trying to provide resources to local school districts. They should be working on developing curriculum, not mandating curriculum, mind you, but developing curriculum and offering it to school districts so they can pick and choose what might be useful in their own schools. They should be there to help school districts, not to guide them, not to mandate to them, but rather to be there to offer assistance. Taxpayers. Taxpayers are left out of this equation all the time. When you've heard similar conversation and debate on the subject of education and the role of all of these players, the one party that often gets left out of that conversation is the taxpayers, but we can't leave them out since the taxpayers pay for it all. They pay for the schools themselves. They pay for those school districts to exist. They pay for the teachers. They pay for the administration. And they also pay for the State Department of Education to exist, as well as the salaries of all of us passing policy in this chamber. The taxpayers pay for it all, and we owe to them honesty and good policy that respects their interests. It's not a comfortable thing to do sometimes, but I often have to remind people that serve on the Board of Ed and some of the towns that I am familiar with that you don't just work for the parents, and you don't just work for the administration, and you don't just work for the students, which is what's always emphasized and should be. But you also work for every taxpayer. Because you're elected by people who have kids in the school system, and you are elected by people who do not have kids in the school system. And your responsibility is to all of them. I say all this because I'm simply trying to put education in perspective the way I was brought up and understood it when I think it worked better than it does today. The final player in that scheme is us. And I think we have the simplest obligation of all, which is to do no harm. If we're going to write any type of law or policy that affects local school districts, we should keep in mind while we're doing it that we should do no harm. I mentioned a few minutes ago that school districts are different. And that's absolutely true. I represent 5 towns. I represent Prospect, Wolcott, Southington, Cheshire, and Waterbury. And just in my own district, I can tell you that the schools across that district, just a few miles away, could not be more different. And you cannot write a policy for those school districts the same. It's just not going to work. You have to adapt to how that particular school district operates. You have to adapt to the environment. The students' backgrounds, and the students' needs are different in each one of those schools, and sometimes they are dramatically different. Creating a one-size-fits-all policy as a state legislature and mandating it for all the schools across the state cannot work very well in a circumstance like that. Nor can creating a state Department of Education and empowering it to do similar things. It just doesn't work. We've got to recognize the differences of the school districts, respect them, and empower them to do what's best on their own. Effectively, that's how great things happen, by the way. I'm somebody who gets up in this chamber and talks about freedom all the time, and that's because I see nothing but the benefits of freedom every time I examine it. And when it comes to education, allowing different school districts to be able to exercise their own free will to make policy, to adapt to their own circumstances and situation, to me is a benefit. Instead of one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter policy. And the other additional benefit about that is that if one school district comes up with some brilliant plan that is very effective and they end up with tremendous results and the kids there are doing great in some subject, that can be shared. Other school districts can look at it and say, hey, did you see what they're doing over there in Prospect? Did you see what they're doing over there in name any town? We should try that here, or we should try parts of what they're doing. But if you end up having one small group of people making policy for everyone, there is no more invention. There's no more ingenuity. There's no more chance to find new ways to do things that will be better. I don't mean to go on and on. I just wanted to provide a small amount of perspective to this conversation that has not already been shared. I put in a number of education bills every year, actually. Basically trying to address some of the current concerns that I see. And sadly, those bills rarely go anywhere. And in fact, I think I put 4 bills that went into the Education Committee this year, and none of them were raised for a hearing. But I do have some amendments today, and some of the amendments that I'm going to offer are very similar to the bills that I originally offered. And let me start with the first one. I have an amendment, Madam President. It is LCO 9264. I ask that it be called and I be given the opportunity to summarize.
Mr. Clerk.
LCO 926.
Thank you, Madam President. This is a very straightforward amendment. A lot of folks around the room have brought up this section throughout the conversation today. This has to do with Section 3. And the amendment is very, very simple. It just strikes Section 3 in its entirety. And this is just a short paragraph that says that any person that's been elected to a local or regional board of education for the first time shall complete a training program prescribed by the Department of Education, and they have to do it within 1 year. And I would like to move adoption of that amendment, and I'd ask for a roll call vote and an opportunity just to speak for a moment about the proposal.
So thank you, Senator. We will have a roll call vote, and please feel free to discuss your amendment.
Thank you very much, Madam President. So clearly the issue that comes forward when we look at this paragraph in the bill that's before us is a question about whether or not there is a need for training for new elected members of local boards of education. And I can't say that that's not necessarily a good idea. The question is, who should be doing this training? And my opinion is that because these board members are elected locally by the members of their communities, in keeping with the framework that I just laid out, it is those school districts that really ought to be responsible. It is those people in those districts that ought to be responsible for training their newly elected members of boards of ed. I don't see how having a state department can possibly give them the wisdom that they need to represent the people in their districts. That wisdom comes from those people. That's how our representative system works. We are all here as a result of being elected by the constituents in our districts, and we serve them. We serve their needs and their wishes. And that's what local Board of Ed members do too. So I don't see a benefit in providing them with training from a state body. They need to learn the will and wishes of their constituents first and foremost, and that is what they need to do in that role as a member of a local Board of Ed. I think this is a good amendment, Madam President. I encourage my colleagues to support it.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Will you remark further on the amendment?